Hello, everyone. My name is Naveen. I am the moderator for this session today. The ASP.NET in Linux and Windows containers. We have Rob Richardson, who is Microsoft MVP. I think he's going to show us today the ASP.NET execution in containers in Windows and Linux. Just before we start the session, whenever you have a question, feel free to type that question into the Q&A box, which is next to the presenters window. We will take those questions as we progress. Thank you. Rob, over to you.
Very nice. Thanks for the introduction. I'm excited to share this with you, ASP.NET in Linux and Windows containers. Here is my one and only slide. You can grab this code right now at github.com/robrich/ASP.NET in Linux and Windows containers. You can grab that link from robrich.org, click on presentations, and here it is, ASP.NET Core in Linux and Windows containers, and you can get straight to the code right there. While you're here on my site, you can see About Me, which talks about exactly the way the moderator introduced me. So, that's really cool. Microsoft MVP, friend of Redgate. AZ GiveCamp is really fun. AZ GiveCamp brings volunteer developers together with charities who otherwise couldn't afford software services. We start building software for them Friday after work. Sunday afternoon, we deliver that completed software back to the charities. If you're in Phoenix, come join us for the next AZ GiveCamp. Or if you'd like to see a GiveCamp in your area, hit me up on email or Twitter, and let's get philanthropy installed in your neighborhood as well. But let's dig into ASP.NET because that's going to be really fun. So ASP.NET. Right now, I have an empty folder. Here's that folder. Let's go build some code in it. Empty folder. Okay, first step, .NET new MVC -- name site -- output into the current folder. Now we could definitely go file new inside Visual Studio or scaffold up a project inside VS Code, but by using the CLI, we'll be able to get this into place really quickly. New in ASP.NET Core 3, it automatically does a .NET restore for us, which works out really, really well. Okay, so now that we've got that, let's fire it up in VS Code. Again, we could pop it up in Visual Studio, but VS Code might be entertaining. Let's give it a try. Here's this site. We have controllers. Here's our home controller. We have views. Here's our index view. And let's add some stuff about this site just so that we can see how it works. ASP.NET version. We'll grab that from system.environment.version. And we'll say is running in, and we'll grab this environment.os version. Okay, so now as we start up this website, we'll be able to see what version of ASP.NET Core we're using and what version of the OS and what type of OS we're using. That's cool. So now we can run .NET run. That will run the site locally. That's interesting. But let's simulate what we would do when we build. .NET build -- configuration. Oops. Let's do that again. Or actually, that one's going to get stuck. OK, there we go. .NET build -- configuration release. And that will do a build. This is not that unlike pushing build inside Visual Studio. Now that we've got that content build, let's do a publish. We could right click inside Visual Studio and choose publish. But here inside the console, we can do a publish with .NET publish. Oh, it looks like this build is taking a bit. There we go. Now we've got a build. .NET publish -c release. So we'll be in release mode. -c is the short form of configuration. And -o dist. We'll just build to that dist folder. There's nothing magic about the dist folder. We could publish to a publish folder. But now inside that dist folder, we have all of the content that we would send to IIS. So here's our app settings. Here's our web config. This is the content that we would want to publish. And this is what we want to get inside the container. So let's fire it up outside the container and see how that works. .NET site.dll. OK, we've got it running. And it's running on localhost 5000. So let's go there. Localhost 5000. And here from localhost 5000, we can see it automatically redirected to HTTPS 5001. And here we are. ASP.NET version 3.19 is running on Windows NT 10. That's cool. Now we stop this. Now our application is no longer running. Let's push refresh. And now it's just going to keep spinning because the site isn't running anymore. OK, let's see if we can get this into a container. Let's create a Docker file. Now, it's important that this is Docker file and not dockerfile.txt. Here in this Docker file, this is the configuration as code that allows us to build up a Docker image. So we'll start out from, let's go off to Docker Hub and take a look at some base images. We'll go to Docker Hub. We'll search for .NET Core. Here we are on .NET Core, and let's take a look at the repos that we have. So .NET Core has a few, an SDK for build tools. ASP.NET has a runtime. Here's a runtime for console apps that doesn't include web hosting. Samples is great. That's if you'd like to cruise a bunch of Docker files and get a feel for how to build out Docker resources. So let's dig into SDK. Actually, no, let's dig into ASP.NET because we just need to host it. We've already built it. OK, so here's that image. ASP.NET version 3.1. Flip back over to VS Code from Microsoft, .NET Core, ASP.NET 3.1. OK, now let's copy everything from the dist folder into the current folder. And CMD, this is what we'll use as we start up. And so we'll say that same thing, .NET site.dll. Well, what directory did it copy it to? Let's set that, workdir/app. It doesn't matter what that is. There's nothing magic about /app, but that gets us to the point where we now have copied that dist folder into our current folder, the app folder, and then we'll run the site. We do need to grab a few extra things. We'll set some environment variables that will tell ASP.NET Core how to launch in production, to launch on port 80, and we'll expose port 80 to consume from outside of Docker. Cool, let's go build it. Docker build -t, step 1, T is for tag, step 1, and we'll give it the folder that we're building from, dot. Actually, let's step back into this folder that has the Docker file in it. There is Docker file. So Docker build -t step 1 dot. OK, now this is going to go through the build. We've already built ASP.NET, our website. We've already published it to the dist folder. So this isn't going to do anything about building. It'll just copy that content into the container. Great, we've got a container that's running. Docker run -p. We're going to bind port 80 on our local machine to port 80 inside the container because that's the one that we chose to expose right here. And let's start step 1. I'm actually going to do it in detached mode or daemon mode, so it'll run in the background. There we go. We've got that container running. So now we can head off to localhost :80. Localhost 80, and we'll see our website. Now it's running inside the container, and we know it's running inside the container because here's ASP.NET 3.1.9 is running in Unix. Ooh, we're running in Linux. That's perfect. Now ASP.NET doesn't know the difference between different flavors of Linux, CentOS and Red Hat, and so it just says Unix, but that's totally fine. We know that we're no longer running in Windows. We're running inside of a container. We can definitely look at that as well. Docker container list. And here is our container. We see that it's mapping port 80 to port 80, and we're running just fine. That was Linux containers because we had chosen when we popped open here to move to Linux containers. But let's flip over. Let's switch to Windows containers. We get this nice warning that says, hey, if you're in Linux containers or in Windows containers, you won't be able to control both. You have to kind of pick which one you'll use. Okay, so now we're in Windows containers. It will take us a minute to get it to start up. And now Docker image list, we can see a bunch of base images around Nano server. We're definitely in Windows mode. Okay, so we still have this Docker file though, Docker build-t step1 dot, which is pretty much what we did last time. We were building it in Linux mode. Now we're building it in Windows mode. But this base image, the ASP.NET image, will work on both Windows and Linux, or rather there's a Windows and Linux version of it. So now let's say Docker run -p. 80 is already taken from the Linux container. So let's say port 81 locally will map to port 80 inside the container. Step 1, let's also run this in detached mode. So now I've got this container running in Linux. And let's go to localhost 81. And I've got this container running in Windows. Give it a second to boot up. Ugh! The demo gods are going to fail me. Docker logs 5335. Did I get a build fail or is it still spinning up? Yes, it's running. So there we go. And this container is running on Microsoft Windows NT. I know that it's running in the container because if I say Docker container list, it will show me that this is the container and it's bound port 81 to port 80 inside the container. Perfect. So now that I've got it running on both Windows and Linux, let's actually stop the one here. Docker container rm 5335. We'll switch back to Linux containers. Yes, we do want to switch. Docker image or Docker container list. Now that we're back in Linux mode, we'll get this one. We'll stop this one. Docker container rm 5b7d. Oh, 5b7b. And we'll stop this one. Now that we've stopped those two containers, we can come back here. And if we refresh, of course, this page won't load because that entire site is gone. This is a whole lot faster than trying to spin up new hardware, install the operating system, boot Windows or boot Linux. These containers make it really easy to get going. That was cool. Well, there was a lot of commands that we had to remember, though. There was the Docker build command and the Docker run command, and there was a lot of parameters there. Let's do this. Let's create a new file called Dockercompose.yaml, and this file will specify all of the run commands so that we can just say, go do it. We'll start with a version. This is version 3, services, web. We don't need to name it anything special, but web works. And we'll say image, step 1, nope, step 1, and ports. We will map 80 to 80. Okay, so Docker Compose now took out all of the details that we passed to Docker Run. We can now just say Docker Compose up, and it will spin up that image and host it as a container. Now that we've got that image running, we could go to localhost port 80 and we'll see our site. Perfect. Docker Compose made it so much easier to do that. Let's spin down Docker Compose. Docker Compose down, and it will take down that container. Now we built outside the container which means before we can even run the Docker build command, we have to do a whole lot of .NET build and .NET publish. Can we get Docker to do that piece too? Let's do it. So let's switch over to folder 2. This folder is empty as well. .NET new MVC, name is site, output is site. So now we've built this into a site folder. Let's open that up in VS Code. After we scaffold it, there we go. And it's gonna .NET restore, which is actually really, really helpful. Okay, now that we've got that restored, let's open this one up in .NET Code. Now we chose in this case to put it in a folder rather than to put it in the current directory, and that's totally fine. We can build inside the folder as well. So our first step in building out this site is to build a gitignore file, .gitignore. Now you may build this as part of a regular project. This is, all of the details associated with Git. So I'm going to not check in the bin folder, the obj folder, the .vs folder, star.user, star.suo. These are all the files that I don't want in my source code. And these are also all the files that I don't want in Docker. So let's create a new file, and we'll call this .docker file. Now this .docker file has those same details, all of the pieces that we don't want to check in to our container. Bin, obj, star.user, star.suo, the .vs folder. But we also don't want to check in this launch settings.json. Launch settings.json is the settings that we need to debug this app. So launch settings.json, it contains all of the details about how we'll run inside of IIS Express or how we'll run from the command line. These are things that we won't want in a production Docker container. We also don't need app settings.development.json. That also won't end up in our container. Okay, now that we've got this Docker file, now we're ready to go to build up now that we have Docker ignore, this is everything that won't end up in our container. Now we're ready to start building our Docker file. New file, Docker file. Now again, this is the configuration as code details that will specify all of the steps that we need to build and then run our application. In our last Docker file, we only needed to worry about running it. So let's head back over to Docker Hub and let's look at .NET Core, and we see this SDK repository. Cool. So this SDK repository includes all of the build tools. Let's go grab this image, and we will say from that. Now we have our build tools. Great. So let's copy everything into that current directory. What's our current directory? Well, let's set work_dir to/src. Okay, now we've got that content ready to go. Let's run .NET restore. Okay, we've just restored all of our NuGet packages. Run .NET build -c release site/site.csproj. Run .NET publish -c release -o/dist site/site.csproj. Now we've done our restore, our build, our publish, and we're ready to run. Let's set our work_dir to/dist where we built to, and then we'll do that same process, cmd .NET site.dll. We still need to bring in those environment variables that tell us how to expose it. And so for the speed, I'll just copy those into place just to make it a little bit faster there. Okay, so now we have a Docker file that will copy in all of our content, run .NET Restore, .NET Build, and .NET Publish, those same commands that we ran from the command line. But now we have that dist folder baked into place, and we can just start that site. Perfect. We can build up a Dockercompose file as well. New file, Dockercompose.yaml. And like we did before, version is 3, services. Let's call this one web again. And now we will give it a build context. What's the spot where we should start building? Well, right there. We can give it an image. Let's call this step 2. Nope, step 2. And ports 80 maps to 80. Now, that's all of the commands that we gave it as we were doing both the Docker build and the Docker run. This file then specifies all of the commands that we were doing to do the ASP.NET Docker build and Docker run. Okay, so now that we've got all of the pieces, Dockercompose build. Now, by default, Docker up will build if it doesn't find the image, but I just did a Dockercompose build just to double check to make sure that it's built. Okay. Ooh, specify a project or solution file. It looks like I didn't get my site specified correctly. Docker build, site CS proj. That does look okay. Did I forget to restore? Oh, I bet I didn't do Docker. Let's set this work.dir to src site. That'll make it a bit easier. Now I don't need to specify all of these details. There we go. Dockercompose build. Okay. Now it'll do all of the steps. It's going to build that web image. We'll start by copying in all of the files. .NET Restore, it now sees the csproj file, so it knows the files that it needs to restore. That's perfect. It's going to do a .NET build. So now it'll go compile all our C# code, build out all the DLLs. How's this build going? Looks like it's going pretty well. Go, 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 go. There we go. Our build succeeded. That's great. Okay, now we're going to do .NET Publish. This will get that content that we need to send to IIS, but in this case, we'll host it inside of a container. Okay, we published all the things to our dist directory. Let's finish up this container. And we've got it built successfully. Dockercompose up -d. So we'll run that in daemon mode as well. And now we've got our website running on port 80, and we didn't need to do anything. It built in a container. It built in a neutral environment. So let's go back to our web browser and let's refresh port 80, and we will see our website. Ooh, we forgot to put the version there. Let's come back into our code and we will do Dockercompose down. And let's go back into that site and give it a version. Okay, let's set that version detail content right there. That looks awesome. While we're here, let's also add some unit tests. So I'm going to do a bunch of things. I'm going to, yes, I do want to paste multiple lines, create a new solution. Oh, it's about to go add a project that doesn't exist. Let's go create that project first. Okay, so .NET new. Now, last time we said MVC, we built an MVC project. Here, let's build an XUnit project that will have unit tests. -- name is site.tests, and -- output is site.tests. Tests. There we go. So now we have a second project. Let's create a solution file that puts these, invalid switch, output, site.test. Now that we have two projects, let's build a solution file that will combine those two together so that we can .NET build from the root directory and build everything. So we built that solution file. Let's now build out the .NET solution, add this project. We just added our first project. Let's add the second project. And now we have a solution file here that includes both projects. Perfect. Here's our site project. Here's our tests project. Let's modify our Docker file to be able to build all the things. So now we can say .NET restore, .NET build, and now we're going to build our site.solution. We could also .NET restore site.solution, or just let it auto discover. And we'll tell it that this is site/site.cs proj. Okay. Now, because we have unit tests, after we build, let's run our tests. Site.tests, site.tests.cs proj. Or if we just left it, it would run all of the tests in all of the projects. Cool. So let's do that. Dockercompose build, and let's rebuild our project. Now, this is not only building our website, but also building and running all of our unit tests. So it's copying all of the things into the source directory. It's running .NET restore for both projects. Restored all the content for the website. Perfect. Restoring all the content for the XUnit projects. Great. Looks like restoring those NuGet packages took a little bit. Now let's do a Docker build, or a .NET build rather, build the entire solution. There we go. Here's our build. Is it going to pass? Ooh, seg fault. Yes, I think we may have run out of memory or done something else interesting there, but that's interesting. What if we have a failing test? Let's come in here and let's create a test, and let's say this test will throw new exception. Fail. That's kind of what an assertion framework does. Okay. Dockercompose build. Let's double check that I saved all the things. I did. Dockercompose build. And now this will spin up all of the things and run all of our unit tests. .NET restore. It's restoring the NuGet packages for both the website and the tests. Here's the NuGet packages for the website. Here's the NuGet packages for the tests. That does take a minute. There we go. Now we'll do a .NET build. Hopefully we don't hit a seg fault this time. Nope, that worked out great. Oh, now we're doing the .NET build. All projects are up to date. Building the website and building the unit tests. There we go. We've got our site ready to go. Ooh, build succeeded. Now let's run our unit tests. Here we're running the tests. Will the test succeed? I guess it depends on whether I push save. Let's see. Ooh, a total of 1 test files matched. Okay, let's run the test. Our test failed. And because our test failed, we didn't get the resulting built image. So we can't run a site with failing tests. That's perfect. Let's come in here and we can get our test to now pass and rebuild, and we'll be able to do all the things. Well, that was really cool. We got our Dockercompose file to kick off all of the pieces. Well, one of the things that's kind of interesting is we could get a Dockercompose file to spin up other dependencies as well. So maybe our application needs not just the website, but maybe it also needs Redis or SQL Server, and we can get it to spin up those containers as well. Here's the magic piece, this links. This says, I would like to link this container to the Redis image and the SQL Server image so that I can contact them just with http://Redis. Perfect. So we could have this Dockercompose file. And at this point, then we do a Dockercompose build, which will build this website, Dockercompose up, and it'll spin up not just the website, but also all of these other dependencies. That's perfect. Okay, so we built inside the container and Docker image list. Here's our step 2 image right here. The step 2 image was 719 megs in Linux. The step 1 image was 212 megs. That's significant. We did get to build in a neutral environment, but it made it so much bigger. Let's see if we can do something to make the image smaller again, but still do that build in a neutral environment. So let's adjust this Docker file a little bit. Here's that same Docker file that we had before, the Dockercompose. Here in this Docker file, what we're saying is copy in all of the source code files and then run a .NET restore, and then finally launch this one image. Now this image does have my source code. It does have all of the build tools, and we want kind of that lighter weight thing where we just had, just these pieces. Should we build outside the container? Well, we could, but then we'd lose that neutral environment. Instead, let's come back up to Docker Hub. We'll grab this ASP.NET Core package again, and we will say from this. Now I'll say this is the app directory instead of the dist directory. Ultimately, whatever that image name is less, or whatever the folder name is less important. But now I want to go copy the dist folder into my current folder, this app folder. But I don't want to copy the dist folder from my root machine. I want to copy it from equals build. Where is that build section? Let's say this is as build. Okay, now when I build, I'll use this as my build server. And when I'm done, I will use this as my production runtime container. This one doesn't have the build tools. It only has the ASP.NET runtime. It doesn't have my source code. We can do one more optimization. Right now, we're restoring our Nuget packages no matter when the code in our system changes. Let's switch that. Let's say I want to .NET restore before I copy in the rest of the things. Now, I still have to tell it what things to restore. So let's go grab this. I still need to tell it what to restore. So I'm going to copy in my solution, my project, my other project. And now when I run .NET Restore, if my projects don't change, if I don't add or remove any dependencies, then I don't need to restore those Nuget packages. That's perfect. I may be able to use cached versions of things. Then I'll copy in all my source code and I'll do the .NET build, .NET test. We've just built a multi-stage build. We have this stage, this from, that is our build server, and we have this from that is our production runtime. Let's fire it up and see if it works. Dockercompose build. Now this will do all of the steps, but it'll actually produce 2 images. The second one, the last one, will get tagged the way we want it to. The first one actually won't get tagged at all, and that's perfect. But we can see that we're already using cache. That's great. We'll have to run .NET Restore one more time to get those NuGet packages. But then after that, all of the NuGet packages will be in place, and we can just breeze through this step. Oh, return non-zero status code. Let me make sure that I've saved everything. Save all. Yep. Let's kick off that build again. I think it's probably about time to reboot my machine. Okay, .NET Restore. I bet the .NET Restore can, all the rest of the steps used cache. That was perfect. .NET Restore. Looking at the projects to restore, it's identified those 2 projects. This is perfect. Restoring all our website projects, and then restoring all of our test projects. There we go. Test projects, test project NuGet packages restored. Now let's do a .NET build. Go, go, go. Oh, we're copying in the rest of our content. My bad. Now we're doing a .NET build. We're building both our website and our unit tests. Let's see how this build turns out. Determining projects to restore. In this case, all the NuGet packages already exist, so it doesn't need to do any of that. Now let's go build the project. We could pass a flag to .NET build to say you don't need to restore, but double checking isn't bad. Okay, so the tests built successfully. Now our website build. Our build succeeded. Great. Now let's run our unit tests. There we go. All of our one test is kicking off. And because our test doesn't assert anything, this will run really fast, but let's double check. Did our test pass? Go, go, go. Yes, our test passed. Oh, a total of 1 test files matched. We didn't pass yet. We're running right now. Yes, there we go. Our test passed. And now let's finish up building this image. We're going to flip over to the .NET Publish that will create all of these resources. And then we get to flip over to that other image, the one that is just the production runtime. This one will be a lot smaller. All projects are up to date. So let's publish the site to our dist folder, and we finished it up. Cool. Docker compose up -d, and we can spin up this website. It validates that it just built it successfully. That's great. And now our website is running. Let's head over to localhost port 80, and we'll get to see our website. I may have actually erased. Nope, there we go. And it is running on Unix. So we could definitely flip back over to Windows containers and just push rebuild, but let's flip over to something new instead. Docker compose down. Cool. So we did a multi-stage build. Let's see if we got the build benefits. Docker image list. Now it used to be 900 megs. Let's go look at this step 2. This step 2 is now 212 megs. Much, much better. That's cool. So by using a multi-stage build, we did build one of these steps that didn't matter. We just threw that away. But then we did build the step 2 that got us back into exactly the size that we wanted to. And we were able to leverage quite a bit of cache as well. Okay, CD 4. Cool. Here in step 4, we're going to look at developing. Now, again, we could pop open Visual Studio or VS Code, but let's say .NET new MVC -- name is site -- actually, let's flip here to here, VS Code. Nice. .NET new MVC -- name site -- output dot. Now we've got a new project here. It's going to do a .NET restore. Let's close this one. Close workspace. Actually, we can just close all of VS Code. There we go. And let's open a new VS Code. Now here inside VS Code, I'm going to copy this into place. And let's take a look at it. Okay. The VS Code, I'm just doing a launch.json, and VS Code can automatically generate these, but just for speed, we'll get this set in place. And this .devcontainer.json is the magic of launching this in a container. Let's come in here and talk about launching in containers. We can come in and say remote containers, try a sample. And once we try a sample, we can pick our language of choice, and that will allow it to automatically gin up an example that is working just fine. Now, instead of doing that, let's actually launch ours in a container, reopen in container, and let's take a look at what that means. So here inside VS Code, we can split VS Code into 2 pieces once we have this remote containers extension. So first thing, I installed the remote containers extension, and that gave me access to those 2 menus. And then VS Code will split itself in half. The first half of VS Code is the UI elements, and that runs on our local machine. The second half is the part that will run in a remote environment, in this case, in a container. But we could also run this over SSH or run this on WSL. So this includes all of the language extensions, all of the processing of things, all of the running and debugging. And this includes all of the visual elements. And then over a port, they just communicate really elegantly. So let's take a look. As this container spins up, we will see that it launches inside of a container. And I love watching this because it's actual real Docker commands that it's doing. It's going to go run Docker. It'll spin up this container. It'll create a volume inside the container that maps back to our host OS, which is perfect. That allows us to be able to develop inside the container, but store our source code outside the container. And the cool part, this is an actual shell. So once it finishes booting, we can take a look at this code and oh, there it goes. There's the Docker commands that will spin it up. That is great. And now it's actually running inside the container. The other piece that we copied into place, besides the launch settings.json, was, not the launch settings. Launch settings is interesting. The devcontainer.json, while it's booting up, let's take a look at the content that was there. It includes 2 files. This devcontainer.json explains how it's going to launch, and this is just the steps. So I gave it a name. I didn't give it anything descriptive. Let's just call this ASP.NET. What's the Docker file that it runs in? Well, we just have a Docker file right next to it. What extensions would I like in my VS Code setting? I'll include the C# extension, so it'll automatically install those once it boots, and then .NET Restore, so it'll get all of my Nuget packages. Perfect. The Docker file is just a really simple Docker file. And I just got the try extension to build this for me. It includes the build tools and it just sleeps so that I just have a container that's running. And then when I'm ready, I can start to launch the things that I need. Now we will need to edit the launch settings.json here inside properties because SSL trust chains are weird. So we're just going to disable the HTTPS piece of this. And now it'll just be HTTP. Perfect. Once this container boots, this is going to kill me because it's taking forever for VS Code to boot. And this demo is so amazing.
Yeah, it is. Super fun.
It is super fun. That was cool.
You're making it super fun, Rob.
I'm so glad.
Yeah.
The other piece that I'll do is I'll come in here inside the views and let's add the content into our view. Home, index. Let's go grab that. That'll show us where we're building. That is cool. Here it is. Actually, while we're waiting for it to boot, are there any questions that we need to address?
So please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box there. Rob will be more than happy to take those questions as him looking at the energy he has in the presentation today.
Yes.
Thank you, Rob.
Sure. And it looks like we may not have time to get to demo 6, but demo 6 is pretty awesome as well.
Yeah.
I understand there's a delay between when I say it and when you hear it. So yeah, definitely feel free to ask your questions in either Slack or Slido. And let's dig in.
Right.
I've never seen OmniSharp take this long to download before. This is this is fun.
Is it anything to do with your computer? I think you said at some point you need to reboot your machine.
Yes, I suspect that only because my machine is streaming and running containers and running a bunch of things that it's just a little tired. I better reboot and it would be just fine.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I did this demo earlier this morning as I practiced, and it was much faster than this, all else being equal.
The thing is, glad to see so many things that you're showing today are going really smooth. Very nice.
Yeah. Oh, the other part, the launch settings gives us this debugger. And what's really cool about this debug task is that now I can just push go because I specified in my dev container JSON that I would like to forward port 5000. When I push go to debug, it will just automatically debug the content that I have ready to go. That's that launch settings.json. And if you flip over to this tab and you don't have this launch.json, then it will help you build it, which is really sweet.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah. This is so cool, but waiting for it to boot is so painful. The other part that I love, and once it fires up, is that this is a Linux box. So if I come into terminal and I switch over to bash, I'm just in a regular machine. So uname -a, it's Linux. It is really, really running on Linux. This isn't like Microsoft Linux. This is like Linux.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's see, installing package netcore debugger. I don't think it'll be able to launch yet until the netcore debugger builds, but let's try it. Let's see if we can kick it off and get it to debug, because launching then on port 5000 is really, really cool. What's really magical, and this will totally blow your mind, let's put a breakpoint right here. Now, typically a breakpoint only works if we're running inside Visual Studio and running on our local machine, but here we want to put a breakpoint running inside the container.
Is this something similar to remote debugging?
Yes, this is remote debugging inside of a container.
Awesome.
Yeah. Downloading Razor language server. Okay, that's going to be a bit. So I think I'm going to probably call this demo a fail. But what's really cool with the next demo is we would do exactly that remote debugging experience inside of Visual Studio. We did a whole lot inside VS Code today, which was really fun. But you may be saying, I'm more comfortable inside Visual Studio. Can I do all these in Visual Studio as well? And yes, in the same way that we set a breakpoint right here inside VS Code and debugged inside of a container, we can set a breakpoint inside Visual Studio and debug inside of containers. We get that same kind of remote debugging experience across VS Code and across Visual Studio while running inside Linux. It's really easy to consider this, container thing a deployment concern, one of those things that is downstream in the build server. But with these types of tools, we can debug inside Windows and Linux containers. We can run inside Windows and Linux containers. And we can get that great, rich experience of building with ASP.NET with containers, not like instead of containers, assuming that the containers will fix things. For those problems that happen only inside containers, we can now use these tools to be able to experience those problems and solve the problems of our users.
Yeah, that's cool. And we have seven more minutes. If you have any questions, as I said earlier, feel free to type those questions.
And if you're watching this on YouTube later and you see a question or want to see how I fixed it, reach out to me at rob_rich and let's see how rebooting my machine solved it. And you can grab this code at github.com/robrich/ASP.NET in Linux and Windows containers. And you can run through each of the scenarios with step-by-step instructions that allows you to set up these demos and execute them as well.
Yeah.
And watch this. The moment that we decide that we're going to sign off at 3:15 is the moment that the debugger is going to pop up. Of course, that'll be exactly the moment. Ooh, it looks like it did it. It's installed. I haven't seen any questions come through, Naveen. Have you?
No, I don't see either. Looks like, your demo is pretty much good to understand people. Maybe that's the reason they don't have any questions. The other reason I can see
it was really easy to do.
The afternoon session, maybe people need some more energy. But yeah, I think overall, it's a very, very good presentation. You covered so many interesting and rich things to learn from the ASP.NET and containers perspective.
I am so glad you enjoyed it.
That's awesome. Yeah, let's give a couple of more minutes to the group to probably respond if at all any questions. Otherwise, we will give a quick summary about what you covered. Probably need your help to summarize it. And then
yeah. I'm actually surprised the debugger didn't pop up, but let's do that. Let's do exactly that. In our first demo, we built outside the container. And building outside the container was interesting. We got to build, and then once we packaged it inside the container, we flipped over to between Linux and Windows, and we saw that .NET runs identically in both places, which is wonderful. That was really cool. So we built inside the container, and once we started building inside the container, we got a whole lot more reliability. When we built in the container, we could get exactly the same steps and run all of our unit tests. And we validated that if any of our unit tests didn't pass, then we wouldn't get a resulting image. So we got to the point where we had a running image. And at that point, then we know that all of our tests pass and we get to the point where we're running. A multi-stage build. When we set out to build outside the container, we had a pretty small container. When we built in the container, our container was a lot larger, and that was a lot less fun. So with a multi-stage build, we have one stage that is that big bulky piece that has all of our build tools and all of our source code. And then we copy the results from that image into a new image that is a lot smaller and a lot simpler. We looked at VS Code debugging, where we could start off and debug remote debugging inside of containers with the VS Code remoting extension. And there's a similar experience inside Visual Studio that allows us to remote debug inside containers. And what's really cool about this demo, and I'd love for you to check it out, grab the code from the link in robrich.org, is this allows you to debug multiple services using a Dockercompose file. It is really cool. And with each of these, you can pop into that project, and the README includes the steps that you'll need to be able to run this project. So here's the source code that we'll build up, and here are the steps that you can use to validate that this works as expected and start to debug the content and experience the benefits of Docker containers in your environment as well. I had so much fun presenting here in Utah. It was great to visit for a minute. And if you have any questions, definitely reach me at rob_rich on Twitter, or click the email me button at robrich.org. Thanks for the chance to present today.
Thank you, Rob, for the valuable time from your side. I think it's a great learning today. Thank you. Thank you all.